Mr. Lunn, if we could have Exhibit 613F, please. I did.
Do you note your name, please?
Yes, it's Geneva Grandy McNeil for Canada with Tim Timberg. Now, Mr. Gillespie, you've talked briefly about this presentation already and noted that it was from the 2009 Causes of the Decline workshop. And I know we've heard evidence from Dr. Richards previously in these hearings on that workshop. Can you just describe for us what the purpose of that workshop was?
The purpose of that workshop was to bring together species experts, oceanographers, ecologists, modelers, senior management to basically brainstorm or scope out the potential impacts that could have caused declines either long-term or in the 2009 return year of Fraser River sockeye.
And who was invited to attend that workshop?
As I said, species experts, oceanographers, modelers, ecologists, senior management.
And at this workshop, were any conclusions as to the role of Humboldt squid in the decline drawn?
Just that they were included in a suite of potential causes.
And I just want to see if I can summarize what I understand from your earlier evidence. Do Humboldt squid overlap in time and space with Fraser River sockeye smolts?
We believe that the potential is there. We have no direct evidence of it.
And do they overlap in time and space with Fraser River sockeye adults?
Yes, they do.
And could a Humboldt squid eat an adult Fraser sockeye?
Given the information provided by Dr. Nigmatullen's paper in terms of size, that would tend to preclude them. The other consideration is that the prey that Dr. Nigmatullen refers to in his paper are myctophids, which are very soft-bodied and slow-moving fish. I would postulate that an adult sockeye salmon has a much greater evasive capacity than a myctophid does.
And are Humboldt squid specialized predators?
No, they're generalists.
And if we could have the Commission's tab 41. Sorry. Thank you. And now you briefly discussed this document earlier in your evidence. I understand it's a summary of a presentation that Dr. Mark Trudell made at the PSC Causes of Decline workshop.
Yes.
And did you contribute information to this presentation?
Yes, I did. Yep.
And what information did you contribute?
I contributed the chart, figure 3, within the document, and also had conversed with Dr. Trudell about what evidence we had that Humboldt squid may or may not prey on salmon.
And if we could turn to page, I think it's 47.
Thank you.
Oh, that's good. And that would be in this section 6.0, is that right?
Yes. He may have been aware of the previous PSC presentation that indicated the wound on the Chinook jack, but since the otolith information came through Dr. John Field, I would have conveyed that to him.
Thank you. Now the PSC final report, well, perhaps we can just pull that up. That's Exhibit 73, Mr. Lunn.
Just for the record, tab 41 is Exhibit 573.
Thank you. And this document notes that predation by Humboldt squid is unlikely to have impacted the long-term decline of Fraser sockeye as the squid are recent arrivals to BC. And do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I do.
And why is that?
As I said, we had no definitive proof that Humboldt squid were in BC coastal waters until 2004. The only anecdotal evidence that we had that they were even moving northward was in the mid-90s, and the period of decline was started considerably before that.
And I note that this document doesn't reach any conclusion as to the likelihood of squid effects on the 2009 Fraser sockeye returns. And what's your view on that likelihood?
As previously stated, there's a fairly low likelihood of overlap without migrating smolts, which would be the life stage that would probably be most affected by Humboldt squid predation. So I would agree that they were not likely to have contributed to the low returns in that year.
If we can have Exhibit 822. Now, this is your more recent presentation on Humboldt squid. When did you give this presentation?
That was in the workshop earlier this year.
And where did you give this presentation?
The presentation was in the NIMO, Vancouver Island Conference Center.
And I guess what was the forum in which you presented this?
The forum was largely a reconvening of the previous workshop to return with more information, update any information that had been gathered since the previous scoping workshop.
And what was the new information contained in this presentation?
The new information was the definitive evidence of predation on salmon by Humboldt squid, but the lack of definitive evidence of predation on sockeye.
And did these results change your previous conclusion about the likelihood of contribution to the long-term decline or the 2009 returns?
I would say no in both cases.
And what do you understand are going to be the next steps coming out of this workshop?
My involvement in these workshops has been fairly limited, mainly as a provider of information. I'm not sure what the next steps are, but probably Mark Saunders or Laura Richards would be the people to talk to about next steps in this process.
Thank you. Now, you were asked earlier about possible hypotheses on why squid are moving farther north, why Humboldt squid are moving farther north, and you mentioned something called the oxygen minimum layer that the squid like to use. Is there anyone at DFO doing work on the oxygen minimum layer?
The oxygen minimum layer is certainly being examined as part of the regular oceanographic work that's carried on at the Institute of Ocean Science. The person that I've had the most discussion with there, or the person who's been most engaged in terms of the relationship to the oxygen minimum layer in Humboldt squid, is Dr. Frank Whitney, who's recently retired, but is still active in research at that station, and he has colleagues there that would continue to work on that project.
I guess the squid are moving farther north. Are they an invasive species?
The term invasive species has a lot of policy implications. I know that the squid arriving in the north has been characterized both in the open literature and the media as an invasion. But we in DFO have a policy definition of what an invasive species is that includes either demonstrated harm or the potential to cause harm, and on either an environmental, economic, social scale. And to qualify as an invasive species, the species has to be non-indigenous, which means that it has to have overcome some natural barrier to distribution through human intervention, through anthropogenic means. In this case, Humboldt squid were already present in the Eastern Pacific and had just expanded their range. So under the policy framework, they don't qualify as an invasive species.
And were there any human influences on that range expansion?
It's been pointed out that if you follow a certain line of belief, that there are tenuous links that human activities have caused climate change that may have influenced the distribution of these animals, but it's not a direct human intervention as an introduction would be, moving it from one place to another.
And are you aware of any marine aquatic invasive species that could affect Fraser River sockeye?
With the exception of possibly some harmful algae that I don't know very much about, no, I'm not aware of any.
Now, you mentioned that the squid didn't arrive in 2010, and thus you didn't do any sampling in 2010. Were you prepared to sample in 2010?
Yes, we were. I had a commitment of additional funding potential from Mark Saunders and Laura Brown, the two division heads at PBS. I had also made inroads with the PSC sampling teams to see if we could do some sampling in concert with their test fishing. I had made contacts with the service providers that provide at-sea observer coverage and also dockside coverage of groundfish landings for opportunities to sample squid that might have been encountered in either of those fisheries.
Thank you. And how much funding were you able to secure?
I was told that I could spend up to $25,000 to support a survey program if the need arose.
Thank you. I want to turn now to ecosystem-based management, which I know you've been watching these hearings for the last 2 days. You've probably heard that conversation unfolding. When we talk about ecosystem-based management, what does the management portion of that word mean?
Ecosystem-based management. Can I attack it from the other end?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a science person, so I'm more familiar with ecosystem assessments. So ecosystem assessments, as we've heard, is a selection of indicators and looking at the state of those indicators to reflect the health of the ecosystem that we're trying to manage within. The next step in that progression is basically what we've been talking about here for the last couple days, is ecosystem-based fisheries management. So you have a single species like a sockeye salmon that's your focal point, somewhere to hang your hat on to begin the conversation, and you try to bring in all of the aspects of the ecosystem that influence that species. I think the ecosystem-based management that Dr. Christensen refers to is a more holistic approach where you don't have that focal point, you're just trying to manage the entire ecosystem to some ideal state that gives you certain benefits. And to be clear, ecosystem-based management is not managing the ecosystem. The only thing you can manage are the human activities within that ecosystem and assess their impacts on a broader scale throughout the ecosystem.
And within DFO's sphere, what are the human activities that can affect Fraser River sockeye?
For Fraser River sockeye, there's a fairly broad suite of human activities that involve upland land use, pollution, contaminants, fisheries on all levels, indirect effects through removals or bolstering of other species that might influence them, and things like eutrophication that might affect productivity in certain parts of the system.
Can you explain for us the policy context for ecosystem-based management at DFO?
With all due respect, Mr. Commissioner, I think that I'm going to object to this line of questioning. We weren't given notice specifically that this particular witness would be commenting upon ecosystem-based management. Moreover, when he was qualified, we heard no evidence or no background to justify the foundation for this particular line of questioning.
If I could speak to this very briefly, in contrast to Sandy McFarlane, Dr. Ford, and the other 4 DFO witnesses whose summaries all did reference ecosystem considerations and ecosystem-based management, Mr. Gillespie's does not. So in terms of putting participants on notice, I think Mr. Leadham's comment is a fair one.
I was waiting for somebody to object, Mr. Leadham, but seeing as you now have, I think the objection is entirely reasonable. I don't know why Canada is going down the path of questioning this witness about a topic for which he was not qualified to speak, nor was, I understand, this evidence such that notice was given to the participants that he would be giving opinions regarding this area. So perhaps you can give me some sense of why you're going down this path.
I'm hoping to bring some clarity to the conversation that's gone on for the past 2 days, and I'm not expecting Mr. Gillespie to be giving an opinion as an expert on ecosystem-based management, but merely as a scientist and someone who works at DFO. And the particular question is about the policy context for ecosystem-based management. And as a scientist at DFO, he would be aware of that context.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm going to have to wade in on this for obvious reasons, given the day that's Brenda Gertner speaking. I, too, object to this very strongly. The distinction she's making was alive in the questions that I raised and could have been discussed with the previous witnesses if we needed to. I would have had further documents that we could have gone forward. I do not think it's appropriate at this point in time.
Well, again, the concern raised is reasonable. A, not qualified as an expert in this field, and secondly, no notice given that this witness was going to be speaking on behalf of the DFO with respect to the area you're now covering. And so I would respectfully suggest that the objection should be sustained.
Thank you. Mr. Lynn, if we could have Project 8, please. And if we could turn to page 13, and I'm not sure what the PDF number is. And page 13, as we've already heard Mr. Gillespie list which predators may be contributing to the long-term Fraser River sockeye declines and the 2009 return. The first criterion listed here is that the prey and the predator must overlap in time and space. Do you have any comment on the application of that criterion in this report?
As a reviewer or a reader of the report, I struggled a bit in that to determine whether there's overlap in time and space, one needs to understand the spatial and temporal distribution of sockeye salmon. And as someone who's not expert in that, I expected more information about that in the report so that I could judge their conclusions in terms of where that overlap in time and space occurred.
And can a lack of data on a given predator lead one to conclude that there is no predation impact on Fraser sockeye?
No, I would say not.
And can you comment on the author's use of data or a lack of data to exclude predators from consideration for further research? And in that context, I'm thinking of the 6 species they've listed at the end of the report.
I think as we've heard earlier in the hearings, a number of species were excluded from that list because they did not have recent dietary information, which if I was prioritizing species for a research program, I would tend to prioritize towards filling information gaps. So species like Pacific white-sided dolphins that had all of the other requisite criteria met in terms of abundance, distribution, opportunity, but a lack of dietary information would have flagged that for me as a species for further consideration. And similarly for harbor seals, where the dietary information is somewhat dated and the suite of prey that is available to harbor seals is not static. There are changes in abundance. There could have been a shift in preference at that point. So those 2 species in particular I felt deserved more consideration for further work.
And so if the aim is to determine predation impact on Fraser sockeye, what species not included by the authors in those 6 would you recommend for further research?
Those 2 in particular that I just mentioned. The only other observation I have was I was a bit surprised that more fish-eating birds were not included, not so much in the final selection, but in the initial scoping exercise, things like dipper and kingfisher, herons in freshwater, diving birds, and some other alcids in the saltwater environment.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Leadham is shaking his head, so that would leave questions for Ms. Gartner.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm delighted to say I have no questions of this witness. I was going to ask him about how much calamari we could get from a Humboldt squid, but I think I'll refrain.
We can talk after.
And actually, on the same vein as Mr. Leadham, I'd like to pleasantly say to you, Commissioner Cohen, that I unusually have no further questions today, and that we hopefully that neither of us fall prey to further work this afternoon.
I have only one question, and that is that Ms. Grande McNeil asked you if you had how much money you had secured from Mark Saunders and Dr. Laura Brown. And you said $25,000. For clarity, that money was never actually allocated to you, was it?
That's correct. I was given discretionary power to spend up to a certain amount, and that money would be found in slippage and other projects if required.
And that was just a verbal conversation, or did you have that in writing?
That was a verbal assurance.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I have no further questions of this witness. I'd like to thank him and for staying here to the very end of a Friday afternoon.
Till Monday, 10 o'clock. I'll turn this off.